I have the pleasure of introducing our first artist talk for today, which will be delivered by Padmini Chettur. It is called The Temporal Body. I guess some of you have been in the workshop with Padmini over the last few days, and others have also seen her work, her and Martin Fisher's work in the exhibition. Padmini is a contemporary dancer. His career began as a member of the troupe of Chandralekha in 1990. Chandralekha was a radical modernist Bharathanatyam choreographer whose opus dealt with the rigorous deconstruction of the form. Padmini will talk about her work with Chandralekha as well as into the present, and I will leave her to do that.
Thank you to everyone who made it possible for me and for my film to be here. I begin by sheepishly realizing that it should have been Uma beginning this afternoon, but because of a flight I have to catch, I'm beginning. So apologies, Uma, for taking your place here. I want to begin, I realize half an hour is terribly short for me, so, but if I don't finish in half an hour, just stop me and I'll continue. I'm going to begin with an excerpt of a conversation itself. This conversation is one between Pupul Jaikar. Some of you might know that name. We see her really as the mastermind between a lot of the reconstruction projects post-colonial in India, especially the revival of the craft sector. And the conversation is between her and J. Krishnamurti, who we also consider in many ways sort of the master conversationalist, beyond seeing him as a philosopher alone. So Pupul says, can one really be free of tradition? Or is it a matter of sidestepping it and not being concerned with any of it? I'd like to understand it because I always feel that I am carrying a burden, the weight of the past. I would like to put it down and walk away from it, never come back to it. Is that possible? JK says, doesn't tradition mean carrying the past over to the present? The past is not only one's particular set of inheritances, but also the weight of all the collective thought of a particular group of people who have lived in a particular culture and tradition. And later from the same paragraph, he says, you are asking if one can be free of all this. First of all, why does one want to be free? Why does one want to put down this burden? Why? So I will come back in many ways to touch upon a few of these ideas of fleeing from the past, so to say, perhaps the impossibility of that idea, especially with embodied practice, and also to consider in the conversation around temporality, what do we actually mean by freedom? Is that also an impossibility? So I'm going to structure the half an hour by going to certain moments in my own dancing life and career, and to try to trace a moment which ends with the film in the exhibition, so that we can understand somehow my own trajectory of working with time and shifting my work with time through various phases of my own work, my own dancing. So at the age of 7, I began the form which Brooke finds it difficult to pronounce, Bharathanatyam. And at 7, I went into my first Bharathanatyam class in Madras, 3 months after the passing away of my father. And I realized, and I stayed in this Bharathanatyam class for 10 years, not because I loved the form, not because I liked my teacher, he was a really awful man. But I realized at that very young age that there was something about the mathematical, structural, repetitive practice which was immensely healing for me at least. And this exists in some form or other in my work, even though the work aesthetically doesn't resemble Bharathanatyam at all anymore. Most of the time, as you know, I'm just walking somewhere, Isaac. So, I'm going to then fast forward to 13 years later, at the age of 20, after a master's degree in organic chemistry, which made a lot of sense to me. I come back to dance. Yeah, this image, this woman here with her back towards. I deliberately chose an image with her back towards us because I feel she was far too fond of portraits herself. So Chandralekha is this person that Nida referred to. We see her really as the mother of contemporary dance in India. And my work with her over 10 years is the only reason I still am a dancer today. Let me just say that. And Chandra was, of course, a part of the same revivalist movement as Pupul Jekar, and it was really, I think, a moment in India where decolonization was a big part of the conversation, and Chandra was all along very clear that the project of modernizing dance in India had to be done from within, through a certain resistance to the possibilities of sort of Europe swooping down and claiming that space, imposing its own ideals. And interesting for me is that one of her strategies, and she connected many things. She connected also the problem of the way speed and this idea of seduction existed in Bharathanatyam to a problem of time and speed. And consumerism and possibilities of entertaining, mindless entertainment, she called it. And ultimately, she connected many of these problems with the larger problem of patriarchy. And traditionally in Bharathanatyam also, the female dancers often taught and instructed by the Natavanar, who was always a male. The songs were often composed by male musicians, as we know. But that's another lecture to talk about feminism. But just to say that Chandra's strategies and her politics of the way in which she began to modernize the form began with these kind of parameters behind her. But her entry point was actually to slow the movement down to an unrecognizable speed. And that was the beginning of my own thinking around time, or possibilities to change many things just through that simple action of slowing things down. So there we let go of the Chandra narrative. A few years after my working with Chandra, having traveled a lot with her as a dancer in the company, I started to feel for myself two things. At the time, those thoughts were perhaps instinctive, but being a relatively young maker who still thought I could sort of change the world by making contemporary work, that idea has long left me. Nevertheless, I started to see a real problem within Chandra's work, of this idea of slowing movement down, that was somehow combined with Chandra's tendency or need to really stay within a recognizable iconographic imagery. And to me, this combination, where there were always, the image was very important for her in her work, the prehistoric references of matrikas, goddesses, all of this was very important to her. And for me, there was something that was going very wrong in the way that the world was starting to read Chandra, because they once again exoticized the very work that she tried to de-exoticize. And so when I began to work, the problematic of the image itself somewhere connected itself with the way in which time had to be thought about. And I think for the 20 years since, when I've been making my own work, it's really been this negotiation of how do we actually, yes, a body on a stage, a body in a film, it is an image. One can't escape that. How does one give agency to an image in a way that one can avoid the image falling into problematic interpretations was a question for me. And time was very much an important tool in order for me to actually rework my own understanding of body and image. So I'm going to go to a small excerpt from my 2005 work, Paper Dollar. And I'm just going to read a bit because it's clearer. The 2005 work begins to almost humorously begin with a seemingly recognizable image and a gestural language that is devoid of meaning. The challenge of the work becomes the ability of the 5 dancers to exist in a collective time. The entire work is set in Sarva Lagu, beat cycles of 8, which is a Bharathanatyam time cycle. Everything in the work is counted from beginning to end of the 60 minutes. No dancer leaves or enters the stage. So let's just begin by having, maybe just look at a minute so that you can understand this moment for me. See, or is there too much light? Yeah. So this is the action as audience is actually entering the theatre. And often, especially in performances that were, say, in Paris, because we often had always to deal with the expectation of what dance from India would look like. And in fact, the audience would always come into the theatre and think we were dancing Bharathanatyam. And we enjoyed that. And often, 10 minutes after the show began, when they realized it wasn't Bharathanatyam anymore, they would actually walk out. So it was really nice, like, to begin with this kind of pretense of possible seduction and then to sort of shatter everybody's dreams. But what I wanted to say more than that was that you realize even by watching, I think in this line, there are 3 Bharathanatyam dancers and 2 non-Bharathanatyam dancers. And we learned a lot from just trying to time together just almost the impossibility of that task. And from there, this question of how much are we only able to time to the sound, to what we're hearing, and in what way are we able to do that, but as well be actually locked into everybody's timing. And as anybody who's worked with music will know, to put a group of musicians together, also to actually get people to time with precision, is very hard when people come from different histories, different backgrounds. But this was a moment for me when I started to understand, you can pause this festival, that yes, as Chandra used to say, the dancing body is often a slave to the music and to the sound. And so I'm going to jump from this moment to a work that was 3 years later, where a small part, though the larger work itself, called Beautiful Thing 1, is actually an exploration of acceleration and deceleration, quite literally. So the work is always through loops of movement, actually speeding up in time or slowing down. There's one section in the middle, which we can start that, Weston, which is actually just silent, with a dancer who actually speaks a text, which we won't actually listen to. The text that the dancer speaks is really just saying what she likes to eat, where she likes to travel, just very mundane things, almost to distract from this idea of what the Indian dancer is or is perceived to be. And this silent moment is made of only 2 repetitive actions. And this was a beginning for me to actually free the idea of a way of having to time to sound, and rather to shift the attention to a way of having to time simply through the act of being together with a group of other bodies. So this was just a transitional idea. Just watch for a minute. So, as you can see, it's 2 actions that have a beginning and an end. This is something that also became somehow important for me to think, when does the dance actually begin? So, what is the speed of the movement in comparison to the non-speed of the stopping moment? And the whole of this work is very much about coming to stillness and then wondering about that moment when the action actually begins. And just the idea that the speed of the action could be in the stillness and vice versa. So after I made this work, Beautiful Thing 1, for 2011, I had a commission to make a solo. I don't have a big repertoire actually of solo work, and I've always preferred to work in a collective. But I've always loved the way that the learning from working with the group can actually come back to re-inform the solo. So in 2011, the solo Beautiful Thing 2 asks me, we can just continue, this is the Beautiful Thing 2. So you can see there's a similar vocabulary of thinking about the line of the body, etc. Except here the body is alone in the space with too many lights around it, if you ask me. I mean, the light was a material in itself, light designed by Jan Martens, more famous for actually being the light designer of most of Meg Stewart's work. And the Beautiful Thing too, I find myself alone on the stage and I say, what do I anchor to in this moment? Because the transition from working with a group of bodies to being alone on a stage means actually one has an ultimate freedom. Very, very scary place for any performer to be. And so at this moment, my research started to really think, okay, I don't have the bodies around me in the space, but I have an imagination of other things which can anchor me. And I started to work with imaginary ideas of walls, invisible walls in the space, and also with the idea of thinking about the fragmentation of a longer movement. So in a sense, though it appears with this and with much of my work, that it's one long flowing action from beginning to end, I start with the work of Beautiful Thing 2 to consider the idea of a perpetual cycle of a movement and a counter movement that doesn't have to be visible, but the counter movement exists as a sort of an inner resistance to the action itself. So the performer then has a choice of working, the anchor of time itself becomes either through this inner resistance, it could be counter rotation, counter thinking about distance, proximity, through various works beyond this one. I've looked at different ways develop, create and hold this kind of working of the internal resistance, and always in combination to a very specific idea of holding a body in a space. So it's almost like, oh, my arm started here. It doesn't just end anywhere. I know exactly on which line, which point, which wall in space that arm is going to complete that action. So it's the combination and the negotiation for me of these two sets of parameters, one the internal parameter, one the external parameter, that actually for me starts to become the very important way in which time is decided and time is activated. How much time have we at? Moving on. We can just go to the next image. This is just a still from the work I made after Beautiful Thing One, wall dancing, where all of a sudden I think to myself, there's something very problematic about this idea that performance on the stage, especially dance, people don't want it to be too long. It needs to be a nice 45, 60 minute. And with my particular way of working, even that 60 minutes was way too long and boring for a lot of people. But at the same time, I was very convinced that this was what I was going to do. This was the work that I was interested in taking further. So the gallery comes to my rescue, and I start to actually make work that's not on the theatrical stage, where people don't have to sit tight to their seats for the 60 minutes. People can enter and exit. And I went on to make this, which was a 3-hour work, so I start to explore durational ideas as well, and to also just think a little bit more about the temporal relationship also between the performance and the person who's receiving the performance, and how can we actually give choices to both the performer as well as to the audience. And I mean, I'm saying this fully realizing that dance in the museums has been very fashionable in other parts of the world. But in India, it was always very, very hard to convince anybody from the visual arts that dance could also be there in those spaces. So, and beyond this, the next work, Varnam, can we show that one here? This is another work this is a museum in Korea. But the reason I brought this image up is because I think that what was very interesting for me, I'm going to go back to the idea of the image now, is to think about a possibility of reversing the gaze. And I think that this is an idea that I'd like to follow through into the film, which we've installed here. So the audience is looking at me now, many of you, and for me this whole question of reversing that idea, can the performer actually equally look back to actually see an audience as well, and not just become the object that receives this one-directional gaze. So this 3-hour performance, Varnam, which premiered at the Kochi Biennale, who somehow suddenly thought, oh, performance can also be in a Biennale. Very radical thing for in India. Only they were taken aback when I said, yes, but the performers need to be paid. They thought it would be as free as an installation or an object. But this 3-hour performance always begins and comes back repeatedly to this image of a dancer looking at the audience itself. Okay, I think I'm going to wind up now. Brooke, I hope So, the last thing we're going to look at, just because people ask me, well, how does all of this thing that you've been thinking about, how does it relate to this film that's installed here? So I want to just go to this small clip from the film. So the dancer on the left is navigating the staircase backwards. So there's the potential to fall is quite huge because every step is actually a different size, and this was filmed as a single take. I refused to do it multiple times. is far too exhausting. The dancer is wearing a camera, I think on her right ankle. And so the image you see on the right screen is being filmed as the dancers. And so for me, this is how I now like to think about time. Not a decisive thinking around, oh, I want to walk down the stairs and I'm going to do it very slowly. This is going to take 7 minutes. No, rather, what are the parameters around that frame that activity? One of the big parameters was the need to create the counter image. So this idea again of the dancer looking back at the space, looking back at the audience. And so the camera actually becomes the third eye of the dancer, on my ankle, not on my forehead, that's filming the space. And the need to be so cautious, to be so careful with the movement of that camera is actually what's very much informing the way in which I have to be so careful to navigate that staircase. Because I know at the same time, it's not me, the person, the body in the image that's the most important thing. It's also the image that I'm making that is equally important. So this is somehow a way in which in many of my works, whether I go back sometimes into very, very structural work, where the rhythmic precision is so difficult for dancers to be able to execute. But then there's always this idea of parameters, and those parameters might be very simply the need to time with the person next to you. The parameter could be very simply a certain amount of fragmentation of the action, that you have to actually navigate every fragment in order to complete. These are what I see as parameters which then inform our temporality. And that was the point I'm trying to make today, that it's within the parameters, the conditions that surround, that exist within the body, that time is held. It is a freedom of an absolutely structured sort. To come back to this idea of freedom. I'm going to end, and I know Brooke is going to